Hola, buenas noches. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos este miércoles de SOMA. Estamos haciendo colaboración con el Festival Lit Luz. Y el día de hoy tenemos a Gaspar, que nos platica un poquito más de ella. La artista mexicoamericana participante del festival impartirá una charla en la cual presentará sus prácticas y proyectos colaborativos enfocados en crear esculturas sonoras y performances a partir de desechos recuperados del penal cercano a la casa donde vivió en su infancia. Hay muchas abejas. Sorry about the bees, perdón por las abejas. We're trying to really home them. Sí, pero está tomando un poco de tiempo. No son agresivas, de hecho, there. Entonces, tengo una en la cabeza ahorita. Pero, bueno, nos compartirá las estrategias estéticas que le ayudan a abordar la inquietante presencia del término de tensión y creando tensiones entre la persistencia de la arquitectura carcelaria y la posibilidad de resistir la lógica que sustenta este concepto. Entonces, sin más, le doy la palabra a María. Gracias.
Muchas gracias. ¿Me pueden escuchar?
Sí.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias que he venido aquí a mi presentación. Voy a tratar de hablar en español, pero yo sé que a veces no voy a buscar las palabras muy bien, so voy a hablar en inglés. So I'm going to try to weave in my Spanish, but I probably will speak quite a bit of English, but I'll try my best, and I appreciate your patience with me, so thank you so much. It's so nice to see so many friends and collaborators and old friends. My friend Caleb is here, Caleb Duarte, and it's just so nice to be, Carmen is here, and just to be with friends and new friends, so thank you all for being here. Muchísimas gracias a SOMA por la invitación. Estoy muy emocionada de estar aquí con todos ustedes. Y mil gracias a la organización Lit Luz por toda la coordinación entre Chicago y México y por organizar todos los detalles, muchos detalles, para un grupo de artistas y escritores increíbles. Y I'm super honored to be part of this year's theme, repair, reparar, which feels very fitting for this time. So I come here today carrying with me a lot of vitality, love, and solidarity from Chicago, but also a lot of anger and rage. My dear friend, teacher and artist and activist told me the other day to be assured that the regulation of our nervous systems caused by state violence need not always be controlled. That sometimes we have to express our anger, that we have to express our confusion and our rage in difficult times. And I appreciated the ways that she talked about this expressiveness of the way that life comes in all these forms, whether it is joy or anger. In a time when fascist governments are tearing people apart, producing acts of violence and bombardment, we remain resilient and together. So I'm grateful for opportunities like this where we can be in community. I haven't been to Mexico City in a few years now. My father is from San Luis Potosí and my mother is from a small town in Durango. And they migrated to Chicago in the 1960s, working different jobs from farm work to handling factory machinery. My father worked at a factory for 50 years and eventually working in the public school system. Although I've been here many times, returning after my mother's death feels especially poignant. We had the privilege of visiting Mexico City a few times, and I remember those moments with a lot of love. So for this evening, I'm going to spend about 45 minutes or so talking a little bit about my work, and I'm going to highlight a couple of projects. A lot of the projects that I'll talk about center around issues of abolition, of incarceration, and what it means to be an artist working within these spaces of carcerality and freedom and captivity. And there will be some time afterwards for questions and comments if folks want to share something or have a question, I'm happy to chat with you and be in community with you. So I said a lot. Let me see if I can say it in Spanish. But voy a hablar por 45 minutos y si hay preguntas o si queremos hablar un poquito más de un detalle, aquí estoy para hablar con ustedes y vamos a ver cómo nos va. So for over a decade, I've worked on both sides of the largest jail, single-site jail in the United States, which is called the Cook County Department of Corrections, which is located in Chicago, just a few blocks away from where I grew up. Through a variety of artistic projects, including community-based art, sculpture, installation, performance, and sound, I've been working to transgress borders, make divisions porous, and generate spaces to thrive, thinking about how to make these divisions and borders permeable. And recently I was able to record and mark the demolition of Division 1, which is one of the oldest parts of the jail. It's almost completed 100 years, which is part of this larger carceral space that is 96 acres in size. I always say it's comparable to 74 American football fields, but that's American football fields. It is located in one of the largest Mexican immigrant communities in Chicago, or in the US, my bad. So in this clip that you just saw, you catch a glimpse of the high-reach excavator digging into Tier C. My relationship to this carceral place began as a child and resident of this neighborhood. I visited the jail as part of something called a Scared Straight program. Has anybody heard that before? Okay. So Scared Straight program it's a very bizarre, right, program that started in the 1970s. Some say it began at Rahway State Prison in New Jersey and was replicated across the United States over the years, where they would bring usually young people, usually African American, Latino kids, to places that are either military sites or carceral facilities and try to, scare them straight. I think the supposed agenda is to deter crime from what is perceived as future criminals. And so these, experiences like this, though I was very young, I didn't quite understand, I couldn't put it into words, I didn't know what abolition was. I don't know if my parents knew, right, that we were being sent there. But that, the ways that this experience really kind of exposed me to how crime is racialized, how punishment exists, in different city, states, countries, the role that surveillance plays in how we see ourselves or how we see each other. And I began to think about that more with more intentionality as I was also working as a community arts organizer, working with young people and working with just different communities in Chicago. So I'm going to pause here and talk more about this work in a few slides. But as an interdisciplinary artist, I'm interested in community-based practices. Often my projects are multi-year and they include a lot of different kinds of people. Sometimes it's young people, it's incarcerated people, it's other artists, it's activists, families. Sometimes it's law enforcement, it's public officials. And it can be a pretty fragile or tenuous process that's really shaped by power dynamics and social systems. But in my experience, the artist's role in the creative gathering itself, often a community act, make for something that is meaningful, dynamic, and quite complex. So I'm interested in that social space and how that can be generated through a set of creative conditions, and how that creative condition can attempt to transcend penal matter, which is something that Dr. Nicole Fleetwood talks about, penal matter, penal space, and penal time, and turn places of precarity into places of possibility. So this is a project I did in New Haven, Connecticut called Sounds for Liberation, where I worked with a group of local youth and people who were incarcerated at the New Haven Correctional Facility to collectively answer the question, what does liberation sound like? But the detainees at New Haven Correctional told me that they knew more about what liberation doesn't sound like, and that's what they wanted to answer. They wanted to answer that question. So we produced a set of spoken word pieces and musical projects woven with these interviews that we conducted with high school young people who were from this neighborhood, and they interviewed local members and leaders in their neighborhood, and then we sort of did this kind of broadcast, public broadcast, right outside of the jail. So my investigation into sound really started through my mother. She learned radio broadcasting in the 1980s at our local community center, where she later produced her own Spanish language shows, one about Latina women's health and another one on poetry. And I tell this story many times, but I was maybe 5 years old, and I would sit at the radio station waiting for her, in the evening after she was done, and I would hear her read poetry in Spanish, which was very, she had a very sultry, sexy voice, which for a 5-6-year-old was very disturbing. I did not like that voice at all, but I got to really understand, right, somebody beyond my mother, a person, an artist who was expressing herself in these different ways. In the car, she would practice her vowels, a-I-A-O-U, to prepare her voice. And so there's so much in a voice, right? The intonation, the airs, and the mistakes that I really began to appreciate and really think about.
Las uniones hacen fuerte a Chicago y usted debería apoyarlas asistiendo al desfile y concierto de la alcaldesa Byrne con motivo del Día del Trabajo. El 6 de septiembre a la 1 de la tarde es el primer desfile del Día del Trabajo en más de 40 años. Comienza en las avenidas...
There you go. That's not the sexy voice. That's just the information. And so learning to listen became really generative for me in my own practice. And I did a project with these young people who had experienced gun violence in the neighborhood I grew up in. And we started to take field recordings out into the neighborhood and listen to the textures of our block. I invited the kids in my hood to listen together and produce field recordings that marked our streets, that served kind of testimonies to the richness of a place. And so, I spent some time, quite a bit before, doing murals. I kind of came up in Chicago as a young artist through the mural movement, but then moved into time-based public art. And so I'm interested in, scale, proximity, and permeability. How the most marginalized parts of a city, like the viaduct, for example, are also areas of rupture or mending. In Plain Sight was conceived by two artists who you might know, Castles, who used to be based in Los Angeles, and Rafael Esparza, also from LA. They organized about 80 artists to skywrite over immigrant detention centers across the United States on July 4th in 2020. So my public action took place above the Immigrant Detention Center in Robstown, Texas. I took the words of a song by Mercedes Sosa, and so you can see here it says, Soy paz, soy más. And I look at different ways of approaching or marking space and time. These are part of a series called Wretched and Paramount. They're Google Earth studies that were done between 2014 and 16, where I take screenshots of carceral facilities, and I was interested in how the algorithm renders, or sort of misses the rendering of an architecture. So when you look at a Google Earth image of, actually you can't do this anymore, you can't actually get too close to the architecture using Google Earth anymore, but back then you could. And it would render the wall with holes. And I was really interested in this idea of permeation or making this place permeable through the marking of absence, of removing something. And so in these images, the 3D mapping renders the architecture visible, but the screenshots reveal what is left out in the modeling algorithm. And of course, I'm thinking about the erasure of people and this idea of out of sight, out of mind. In Unblinking Eyes Watching, I took 1,000 high-resolution photographs of a major portion of this carceral facility and then stitched them together in a one-to-one image in real scale. And this is a wall vinyl that goes up in a museum, and it acts like an optical illusion on the 25-foot wall in the museum. So again, it's one-to-one. So people weren't sure what wall it was. You know, is it the Mexico-U.S. border wall? Is it, you know, other border walls across the country? Is it, you know, jail wall? So when you move closer to the image gets sharper. And I was thinking a lot about fragments, you know, the way that you work with fragments and as artists, and sometimes when you're working with little resources or what, you know, that the fragments sort of come together towards the making of an image, or just, you know, some kind of cohesive way they come together. And, you know, when I was thinking about fragments, I was thinking about the work of Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who wrote the book Abolition Geography, for example, and Golden Gulag, where she talks about fragmentation as organized abandonment. She explains how this process of organized abandonment consolidates state power and manages the surplus population through policing and incarceration. And her work further defines that role, the role of abolition, the abolition as life in rehearsal, which I think is a really important point, that abolition is both sort of power analysis, but it's also about the building of life-affirming institutions, the kinds that give life, that provide life, that generate life, not the kind that take life away. And so we see these forms of abolition across cities like Chicago with solidarity-building actions during this time of ICE raids. For example, whistles serve as a form of communication, alerting neighbors to ICE, to immigrant and customs enforcement, you know, people using other alert systems to communicate together to protect neighbors and keep people informed with, you know your rights workshops. So how do we picture abolition is something I'm interested in as a visual artist. So this is a 60-hour, 20-minute video installation that documents the demolition of Division 1, which I sort of showed you earlier, but it runs on a loop, and I wanted to show people what the unbuilding of prisons might look like rather than what the building of prisons look like, which I think we've seen a lot of. And so here's another screenshot of a still, of that video. What does it mean to toil with the ghosts of carceral space in the process of becoming obsolete, as you know, Angela Davis talks about? How do we make a graveyard for prisons? So this is another series that toils with that question. It's called Disappearance Jail, and I've made I basically make these punch parties. They're called punch parties. And I do them in different states. So far we've done Illinois, California, Wisconsin, Virginia, Washington, and Ohio, I think. And so what I do is I research all of the carceral facilities in that state, immigrant detention centers, jails, prisons, fire camps, things like that. And then we put them together in this archive, and then I source all of the images from online. I'm interested in how these places are represented. And sometimes they're represented, they look like hotels, you know, the way that they're photographed, the way that they're lit up, the way that they're manipulated in Photoshop. And sometimes they're also hard to find because maybe they're out in a rural community, or maybe it's a new facility, so it's harder to find. And so anyway, I put those all together, and then I print them out, and then I create these punch parties where I invite people to come together and punch them out using hole punchers. And so I've been thinking a lot about that act of marking, almost like the way you would draw, but through the punching out of something. And then usually when we do these workshops, we talk about the carceral landscape of that state. So in Ohio, for example, which is a fairly large state in the United States that is, I would say, primarily rural, a young woman said to me that in her community it is safer to work at a meat factory than it is to work, it's safer to work in a prison than it is to work in a meat factory. It's a lot more dangerous to work in a meat factory. So I thought that was really interesting, right? It's not something that I maybe would have heard in a different city, but it sort of paints a picture about what people's lives are like and how these institutions sort of make you dependent on them. And so this is an ongoing project. My hope is that eventually we'll have all these states punched out. And I often think about Adrienne Marie Brown's work when she does spell casting. You know, I think like maybe these are spells that we're sort of casting together, you know, as a collective, and that, you know, eventually maybe they'll become obsolete. And so this is what some of those workshops look like. This is an installation where I think 3 states came together, or no, 2 states, this is California and the state of Illinois. So I want to go a little bit back to how I started when I was talking a little bit about you know, this place, this particular facility that I've been working in for over 12 years now. And so this is the map of the location of this jail that I told you about, 96 acres in scale. I want to show it from different vantage points so you get a sense of the scale of the place, but also see it on a map. So that's the state of Illinois, I'm sorry, city of Chicago. This is a view from one of their buildings. And you can see the neighborhoods are surrounding this big facility, and these are all the buildings that were torn down recently. So if we think about freedom as a place, I really wanted to think about how, you know, a community might consider freedom in places of unfreedom. So this next set of slides are basically a series of images that document the way that communities coexist. You know, incarcerated community, but also a community of people living around a carceral facility. And we started to think about, alongside other people in the neighborhood, what does it mean when the largest architecture of your neighborhood is also the largest single-site jail in the country? It's the largest architecture. And so we began to really think through that, you know, in these different art projects. So this is the Mexican Day Parade that sets up the floats every September. This is a community festival that happens in the summer. And I was thinking about what direction people are looking. Are they looking towards the carnival rides? Are they looking towards the people on the other side of that wall? Who can afford to look away? And you know, it's a really massive, it's a place of massive scale. The jail and the people inside seem to be totally invisible to their surroundings. And we know that these are highly racialized places that are predominantly incarcerating marginalized communities. And so I'm specifically talking about those groups of people that are, you know, being incarcerated in these facilities. And so I started to also think about how people see this facility. The previous slide is an image of a major, like a bus that passes through a major thoroughfare. So you see the facility from the bus. And then this is from the opposite side, which is from the inside of the jail looking out. And so, you know, we were really looking at what does it mean to negotiate power from either side of this building or either side of this wall. And I organized a community tour, which sounds strange, but we wanted to understand the facility in a more deeper way. So before we started this multi-year project, we did visits and we did walks, and many of us lived in the area, so we knew the place quite intimately, but we wanted to understand it in a different way. And so in 2012, I began a project called 96 Acres, and it was a series of community-based site and responsive installations using sound, theater, with many different collaborators over the course of several years. And you know, we were trying to build the kind of world we wanted, and so we set all of them around the perimeter of the facility. So I'll show you one example out of the 8 that we produced over several years. And this is an intervention where a group of young people from an organization in Chicago called Yo Locali, it's part of the National Museum of Mexican Art, they stenciled and then power washed text onto the perimeter of the jail as a kind of action that was intended to bring visibility to the different roles that we play within carcerality or even our own complicity within those systems. So here's a short clip of that.
I think it's getting people to think about it like the jail's here, it's my backyard, but like doing this is like, you know, it's starting to get your thoughts like, yo, yeah, why do we have a jail like right here? And this community like that makes so much money has something like this here, you know? And we don't have a museum.
We use the pressure washer in the neighborhood usually to remove graffiti. And this is interesting because this is like reverse graffiti. So I really love this idea to use it to put a positive message just by cleaning.
Seeing like, oh, today's your day, it might just change your thought on something that just happened or something like an argument you might have had with a loved one in there.
When you look at the jail, you see people, but you don't see them as a person. You see them as someone that did something bad, someone that's just bad in society and deserve to be the place they are. But sometimes things that people don't really do bad things to be in there.
Well, yeah, I have family that's incarcerated, you know? When my cousins were here, I would visit them almost every other week. It sucks, you can't really talk to him. We're talking through a little hole and like, everybody's talking so loud and you can't really say too much to him, you know? All you can say is keep your head up and like, stay strong, something's gonna be all right, but yeah.
So there's more to that, but here's that's just a little clip. And then a few years after that, I started another project called Radioactive Stories from Beyond the Wall, and it was a 2-year project where I collaborated with 2 core groups of about 25 to 30 men who were detained inside of the jail to produce a large-scale audio and visual broadcast on the exterior walls of this facility. I'd also worked with a group of women, but it was very difficult to work with a group of women because you know, it's a challenge to navigate the different kind of power systems that exist within these places, and there was a lot of resentment that we received from the guards who didn't allow us to work with the women in particular, and so we then returned to working with the men, and which, you know, we were happy to do, but we're really missing a big voice in this project, which is the voice of women that are incarcerated. And so our group became known as a radioactive ensemble, and our goal was to create a kind of sonic movement to turn the wall into an amplification device and visual space, almost like a megaphone, and to think of that wall as a medium of transmission within this place of confinement. So we began producing images and recordings that would eventually take form. Our research and experiments included readings. We read lots of poetry. We talked a lot about metaphor. We read, you know, Sara Shakur's poetry. We looked at, you know, artists like Doris Salcedo, you know, the way she can work with material and in a very poetic way to talk about violence. We engaged a lot of performance exercises, drawing from folks like Augusto Boal's Theater of the Oppressed or Guillermo Gomez Peña's La Cocha Nostra, and learning how to use equipment like field recorders, which we were able to bring into the facility. There was always a guard or 2 at the door, but we managed to carve out a space that nurtured, you know, our creativity. And so I have a little sample of what one of the workshops inside looked like, and I'll play that for you.
Get back in the hole. George, you know the picture. We gonna see the picture and you part of the good Oscar that's representing, you know what I'm saying? See, you gotta have a balance. You got the good, and then you got the bad.
You know, you have like forward and you have less care, like different parts of the digestion.
Makes different parts of the machine.
Yeah.
That's perfect.
Okay, and we came up with what we want to do is something to do with like a checkerboard. We want to do like a timeline. Like we want to start to finish, kind of like how.
So all of you are working separately. What connects all of you together? Okay.
And like DOC, inmate working in.
And the machine digests them through the system, almost, and gets lost through the system and the belly of the beast, kind of like a catacomb.
In the city, they don't want it to be a sort of people's eyes, so they put a wall there instead.
Good job, guys. Good job, Alvin.
Roll call. What? What? Like working out? What?
So these are some drawings that the ensemble made. This is a drawing by Mastian Spencer, and he drew each line of the gated area of the jail so slowly and intently as if each line was felt. And so what we decided to do was to identify elements inside of the jail that felt like a haunting. We were looking at Avery Gordon's work and the way she talks about architecture and ghosts. And we wanted to create these personified elements of material that they were living with. So, for example, somebody chose a DOC uniform, a Department of Corrections uniform, and personified it so it was a story from the perspective of the uniform. And it was important that we use fiction because these are all folks awaiting trial, so they were not convicted, so they were there temporarily or seemingly temporarily, though some people are there for years. And we wanted to make sure that they wouldn't record anything that could be used against them. So we turned to fiction. And so they create these personifications and then recorded audio, which we did with a makeshift kind of like sound studio with two tables and 2 sound blankets. And we were able to record everything inside. Many of them talked about how they either felt like ghosts or were ghosted by their loved ones. Sometimes we did drawings on top of, the facility wall, as we were thinking about this wall as a sort of amplification device. But then these drawings would lead us to these conversations about who the public was, like who was going to see this, who was going to be able to, hear what they were producing. And how they can convey these messages through this, like contentious line. And so this is another drawing by Douglas Johnson, where he looked at a mirror that's made of plastic. In Chicago we have lots of, public parks, and there's these mirrors that are made of plastic, and you can't see yourself in it. And he talked about the inability to see his reflection and how being unable to see his reflection made him feel like a ghost, and so he made a piece about that. And so some of the ensemble members were released throughout this process, and we were able to meet up with them afterwards, and then they helped us sequence the drawings. They made lots of drawings, and then this is Christopher here on the right, who had actually a background as a DJ when he was a young man, and so he did the voiceover for the project when we broadcast it. So it was a great way to sort of bring, these different talents that they had all together for the final cohesive project. So I can play a short video clip of what the broadcast looked like. So the broadcast was live, so people can come, bring a chair, sit, listen to the broadcast that was being played on live radio through this collaboration with a group in Chicago called Lumpin. And then we had these high resolution projectors that were projecting the images that they had made, and then we had animated everything with outside animators. And so it was a 39-minute piece that played on a loop. And if people were unable to attend the live broadcast, they could tune in on the radio and listen to the narratives via radio.
I talked about my experience while I was incarcerated and giving people a chance, just letting them see what the people on the inside on their day-to-day, on what they grow through and their experience.
Break it off, leave it slowly, every day, cause you're our chief and weak mistress. Florida. If this one can talk Christmas scratches and they be cooking in a 5-star restaurant, ingredients straight from the commissary list, using stuff like 20 ramen noodles, soy sauces, chili, hot peppers, chili, onions.
It's designed to make you feel like you're nothing. It's really designed to make you feel like you work for it.
The most traumatic event in my life would have to be at an early age.
When those images were projected onto the wall, I was able to see it in a whole new way. I was able to see inside without actually having to go inside. I was able to see what people are thinking about, what stories they're telling, where they've been, who they are.
It
it's huge. It's a barrier. It's heavy. The material is cement. You can really see what's behind the wall. It's something that separates two worlds.
The light by me, and worse to worse, when it's dark because of me.
There's that digestive system that they were talking about at the end. And so during the broadcast, I invited a couple of friends who do really wonderful work, and we partnered, and they were doing screen printing on site, making posters and distributing them. Their families came out, some of the ensemble members talked firsthand about their experience, and their family members came, and it was just a really beautiful moment. And so I want to maybe talk a little bit about, just in the last section of the presentation, about a project I'm currently working on. And so during the height of the pandemic, I was not able to return to the jail because it was a COVID hotspot. So I also had a 1-year-old son, so it was just a challenging time, and of course managing through a pandemic. But I had learned that they were demolishing, this division, and so I was able to get permission, oddly enough, to set up a camera inside of the jail compound. And then also I was able to work with some local businesses to set up some cameras on top of their rooftops. And I really just wanted to record, this moment of the demolition. So here are some pieces of footage from different vantage points, which is sort of still at my studio, and I'm still working through it. But when I was recording the demolition in that first 60-hour video that I showed you a clip from, I had been spending every day in front of this one building, like the work hours of a demolition crew, 7 to 3 p.m. And I met a lot of people. I met people who were going to court, or people that were guards who came to watch this building get torn down because they used to work there, and they wanted to witness this 100-year-old building getting torn down. But then I met this judge who came over and asked me what I was doing. He returned and he gave me a jail bar as I think he thought it was a memento, and he thought it would be a nice gift to give me. And so you can see the way that the cells look here on the left. And at first, when he gave me the bar, I thought, that it was pretty bizarre to hold this material that in many ways represents a form of state violence. And what does it mean for me to hold it in my hand? And what does it mean to almost to contend with it, right? And like, how do I think about this? And what is my responsibility as an artist? And so I spent some time with the material, and then I decided to go back and get more. So I went to the entry of the demolition site, and the guards were actually laying out all the material. They were laying out the cell bars, they were laying out the bricks, and I think they were doing that so that the workers, at the time there were maybe 5,000 staff who work inside this facility, could come and grab like a piece of this historic site. And so over duration of a few days, I went back and grabbed a couple, until at some point the guard said, I don't know what you're doing, but you can't take any more. Just an artist. And so I managed to get a set of bars, which are 18 bars, and I got a couple of bricks. And I spent quite a bit of time at the studio just moving them around and thinking about them, photographing them. This is from a series of photographs where I photographed them, and they almost look like forensics, I guess, in a way, but I just wanted to, I wanted people to see them in their natural form, and then they're printed out in 1-to-1 scale, so when you see them, in an exhibition, that's exactly the scale of the bar. And then I started to cast them because I was thinking about visibility and invisibility, and how these are materials meant to stay rigid and static. And you know, there's when I did a community tour some years ago, I remember one of the guards saying, you know, like, this jail is made of steel. Like, it can never be torn down. Like, it's never, right? And so I was thinking a lot about that, and his, you know, he was so adamant about this, right? Like, there was like a promise for him or something in that moment. So I decided to cast them in glass because I wanted them to be almost like windows, so that these things that were rigid could then be fragile. They could break very easily. And you know, glass is such an interesting material because it's sort of amorphous, so like it's not liquid, it's not solid, it's sort of in between. And so the fragility of the material is very intentional. It's named after a text by Toni Morrison called "Invisible Things Are Not Necessarily Not There." So this is just an image of one of the transformation. And you know, there's a lot of thought that went into the type of glass, or like the type of see-throughness that would be achieved. I wanted enough see-throughness so that you know it's glass. I made other casts of them in resin, but they looked like props, and I didn't like how that looked, and so I turned to glass. And so I started to think about like Tina Camp's Listening to Images, and I was thinking, what would it mean to listen to objects? What would it mean to be with the material through touch and through vibration and through resonance? And what does the material have? And I think there's, you know, a legacy of artists who are creating that kind of alchemy. You know, Pedro Reyes is with the guns, and who's the artist, Guillermo Galindo, who also works with material that he finds at border crossings and turns them into these like sonic pieces. And so I was interested in thinking about, you know, what would it be to pull sound from these materials, and what do they have to say? So I started to attach different kinds of microphones, contact mics, and you know, rubbing sometimes other pieces of metal on top. They're made of steel, so they're quite interesting because they sound a little bit like bells, oddly enough. And I didn't change the material really, except for removing the paint on top, because I needed to test them for lead. And then I started to play them as a vibraphone, and so I wanted to make sure the paint wasn't going to pop. So you can kind of hear the sound that they make here. I mean, like, steel's very interesting because in Chicago, the steel industry was really important to the history of the Midwest. The building of railroads, the building of prisons, and then of course to consider like who was building the railroads and the different migrant communities that created that infrastructure, you know, and what kind of labor took on these materials. And it's also interesting because it's derived from iron, which is also coming from the Earth's core, which is also iron is something that we need in our bodies. So I think there's a lot in this material that is still kind of being unpacked. So when you heard those bars, they were, for people who do sound here, they were basically just laid out on pieces of foam. But I'll show you over time it's it's evolved quite a bit. I'm not a musician, so I've been kind of learning as I go and kind of leaning on my musician friends to help me figure it out. So I named the piece "We Lit the Fire and Trusted the Heat." And I think a lot about how fire is both something that could be dangerous, but also is something that brings warmth. And this idea of trusting the heat, it comes from an Angela Davis quote, by the way, from her autobiography. But I was thinking about how, trusting the heat is also like this, like this way of working in community that is about trust, that is about learning and evolving and making mistakes along the way, but trusting the process. And so I wanted to create a kind of invitation and work with musicians to then activate the bars. So basically the piece is sort of like a sound sculpture, maybe it's like an intoner, and then I invite different musicians to play the bars, to activate the bars as a way to imagine like the act of touch as a form of liberation or transfiguration or alchemy. So there's been a lot of collaborations. I started with my first friend, collaborator, Dr. James Borden-Williams, who comes out of UC Santa Cruz. So he played the bars, and he's an amazing scholar too, who became really interested in thinking about the way that material or matter has a life, and he wrote a little bit about that. And then I worked with Samora Pinderhughes and Elena Pinderhughes, who are musicians in their own right, really incredible people, and they created this hour-long concert where they, involved the bars into their already set compositions. So it was really great working with them. And the way that the bars were laid out was just on pieces of felt at about 75% at each end to create the most resonance out of it. And then lately, I've been working with a jazz musician, as a matter of fact, named Thaddeus Tukes, who comes out of Chicago and who has been really a wonderful collaborator because he's also local, and so we spend a lot of time together working on this project. And so he's been performing the bars lately. And so what's changed though is I made this resonator case that's made out of birch wood, and each bar has its own box or intoner, and then the bars are laid out quite simply on these pieces of string that I put together, and then the musician can move and arrange the bars as they wish, because I didn't want them to stay fixed, so the musician can move the long bar to this side or the short one to that side, but they're interchangeable. Sometimes Thaddeus plays most of them, sometimes he plays just some, sometimes he plays the glass bars too, which is what we're working on for the next performance. And I've learned a lot from this process, and it keeps changing over time. In this performance, he included a drum kit and then his own vibraphone, and he goes from the drum usually, which is a really hard, loud sound, to then the jail bars, which have this bell-like sound, and then his vibraphone, which has a much softer feeling. So it's quite interesting to think about how they relate to each other and how they create a kind of conversation with each other. Usually when we do a performance, we connect it to some sort of conversation with an advocacy group, or once we worked with somebody named Jimmy Soto, who's part of a No New Prisons campaign. So people who want to get more involved can have like a connecting moment with somebody who's doing a grassroots project and who want to get involved in it. So maybe I'll end with a performance by Thaddeus, maybe end on a beautiful musical piece. that was a good beat. I'm gonna end there. Thank you.
Seguimos espacio para preguntas. Anyone has any questions? Podemos hacer en español o en inglés. Le traducimos. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was so touching. I love your project. I love how it's like architecture is like so central in your work, but also like develops in all of this project. My question was rather like, how was the relationship with the prison? Is the wall a public space, or is it like private, or how did that come about that you've been like, kind of like, were you sweet talking them, or just maybe talk a bit more about that relationship?
Yeah, so the wall is county property, and actually the wall is county property up in 10 feet from the wall is county property. So if you get within 10 feet, you have to ask for permission. Yeah. So yeah, there's a lot of negotiation that happened behind the scenes with the county and with the sheriff's department, and you know, something that was really important to getting some of these projects off the ground was having community organizations who've been there in the neighborhood for a long time and who believed in the project and who wanted to see it happen. And it was through their advocacy and through their relationships that we were able to just have a meeting with the sheriff's department and even propose the idea. And you know, I think it's it's tricky because you know I think as an artist I had to be mindful that I wanted to be mindful that these are relationships that have been in the works for a long time, and it wasn't just like this project, but this longer, this years of relationship building that I was then entering. So I just had to be mindful of that. You know, it's interesting, I think, for folks here maybe who've worked in places like this, sometimes you have advocates within that system that won't publicly state it or who won't tell you so, but they advocate for you in small ways. Maybe it's by, yeah, I'll just say it like that. And so there's a lot of things that go unsaid a little bit. But you know, I think what's interesting too is that you start to, I mean, there's clearly, you know, a power dynamic here. Like clearly, you know, there's people that are behind those bars, and there's people that work there. There's, you know, there's people with the white shirts. I mean, there's a whole system in place. You know, but then you get to think about how this whole system is, you know, oppressing a whole group of people, you know, everybody, you know, like everybody, and you know, like the carceral space goes beyond those walls too. You know, it's not to say that it stops there. Certainly, it doesn't. And I think we're seeing that a lot of that right now with what's going on with in the United States with ICE and with detention centers and all of that. And so I think it's, you know, it's a complex system, but I think the advocates, the community advocates, had a huge role to play in letting us kind of even consider doing something there. Yep. Mm-hmm.
So, very interesting work, and thank you very much. It's interesting to me because just this week I was discussing a very public case that was out in the news, and it was about a man who killed a woman, and the woman's family went out to the street because they wanted the case to be labeled as a feminicidio to extend the man's jail time. Because the maximum sentence was longer. And I was like, as I was having this conversation, I was, you know, I looked at all the like very superficial information you get on social media and whatnot, Like I was saying, I hope this guy gets he stays in there for the rest of his life. And then I come here and I see your presentation, and it confronts me in a way that is very interesting. You know, it's like because your work is mostly about finding. Well, the way I interpret it is about thinking about other ways as a society to deal with this unpleasant or this these horrible things that happen within society. And I'm wondering how, as an artist, you deal with this tension, if you ever get it, or if you're ever confronted by people who, like your work, rubs them in the wrong way.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that question. Yes, I think that certainly comes up a lot, thinking about just harm and the ways that harm, like you said, harm shows up in society and perpetrators and victims. And, I think that the way that I try to think about it is to think about it in a systemic way, that there's a larger system at play that is racist, that is anti-trans, that is anti-immigrant, and that creates, is creating forms of criminality that are, I think invented, made up, but also, of course, there's, situations like what you've described that real harm and violence was caused. But I try to think about it in a systemic way because although I understand, these stories, and I've had harm happen in my own family, that if we think about it systemically, we might be able to create these alternative solutions and maybe deal with other ways of dealing with harm. And I might, think about, at least in the United States, there's a woman named Mariam Kaba, for example, who runs a juvenile justice organization, and she has been really active in creating restorative justice circles, and she specifically works with people who have caused harm and people who have been harmed, and she writes a lot about it, and she has a lot of experience mediating conversations like that. And so I like to look towards people like that who have spent a lot of time on the ground working with, different perspectives, and who can bring an awareness and maybe, an important dialogue between people that maybe can create these alternatives. But absolutely, I think it's a difficult subject, and I think the reality with the situation in the United States is that we incarcerate more people than any other country in the world, 2.5 million people. And that's a lot of people, and when we look at the people that are in there, we begin to understand the ways that systemically there's root causes for, disinvestment, and the way that disinvestment and extraction shows up in our communities, pulling people away from their families, creating cycles of violence. So I don't know, I think there's a lot there, and I appreciate your question because I think it's very important, and I don't want to take anything away from, people who have experienced that kind of violence and harm. Yeah, thank you.
No, I wanted to just add my thoughts, like it's really contributing something beautiful to it, although there was violence, but you made it was really touching in a sense, so that art can heal this violence. So infrastructure that is not being something the process to heal. So a lot of feeling, it really touches me also. Also, I agree with that there was a movement to be more, but also there's a lot of violence and community narratives. So I feel like it's also very interesting. Hopefully, it helps if they go out, that it changes society. Community creativity, and I appreciate the multi-presentation. This was my comment.
So yeah, I agree. Thank you for sharing. My question is more directed to a bit also the process, the fictional process, the workshops in itself. Because I see that as a very rich part of the process, using also storytelling as a way to tap into different symbolic layers of also how reality is created and how we can also shift and create in different ways. And that in itself, I think it's a great methodology, and I'm just wondering if you published somehow, because also talking about the systemic layer of the work could be replicated without any other intention, but to use storytelling to tell, you know, some part of their stories of how different concepts.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, yeah, thank you for that. Thank you for those comments. Yeah, I mean, I think I'm interested, just as an artist, like different ways of storytelling, because I even think that the bars are a form of storytelling, just not in, maybe in a more abstract sense or in a more sonic sense. But, you know, there's a great project called Tam's Year 10 that existed in Chicago for some time, and they did this very beautiful project. I forgot the name of it, but they were, well, there's a lot of projects, but Tam's Year 10 is one. Solitary Gardens in New Orleans is another one. And so Tam's Year 10 did a project where they worked with people in prison who are experiencing solitary confinement. They asked them, what's an image that you would like to see? And so they filled out a form. Then the organization invited an artist to create that image, either photographing it or maybe drawing it, and then they would receive that image. And some of those images that the people requested were very, very imaginative. You know, some of them were, you know, like sometimes humorous too. You know, like I want to be out in front of a Bentley and like with pot of gold, or like these, you know, these kinds of things. But some of them were also like a picture of my home, and I want to be in front of it. You know, something like that. And so I think there's that act of storytelling that is also a very almost simple form of getting these stories and creating these images that tell these larger stories. But I think the process of getting that story was very, very powerful. And so I like the ways that some, you know, like these creative projects can do that, can kind of exist in maybe more long-term ways, but maybe in more short-form ways. Solitary Gardens does something where they work with people in solitary. The people in solitary design a garden. She builds it in New Orleans, the size of a solitary confinement cell, and they grow whatever things that they want to grow, you know. And so she told, Jackie Summel, the artist, told me a story about how one of the men had cancer, and so he wanted to grow herbs and plants for like cancer patients, and that's what they grew, and then all of those plants and herbs went back into the community. Now I think they have an apothecary and things like that. And I think that's also a form of storytelling, but in another kind of way. And so I like to think about, because sometimes within these places, you have such limited time and you have such limited resources. And so this could be a way that project can exist over many years, but through that, you know, that one interaction, and maybe there's other interactions that happen over the years with maybe correspondence and updates on the garden. But I think those are also really interesting ways of transmitting, you know, these ideas or these stories.
Pues listo. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos.
Thank you.
Igual les recordamos que el festival tiene actividades hasta el sábado y pueden ver todo en la página en litluz.org. Y justo también María va a estar en una charla el sábado en el Chopo con escritoras y otras artistas de México y Estados Unidos, entonces por si pueden darse la vuelta. Igual les recordamos todos los miércoles son miércoles de SOMA y el próximo nos acompaña el artista Cristian Camacho. Entonces, gracias por venir.